Will Goldstein here, thekingscourt.com, and a chance to subscribe down there before you forget. Doing again the C.S. Lewis Mere Christianity. This is the beginning of book 4, and book 4 and this book is C.S. Lewis entitles Beyond Personality, or First Steps in the Doctrine of the Trinity. So the first chapter in this book, C.S. Lewis entitles Making and Begetting. So that's his title. I'm going to give it a slightly different title because I'm a little more direct to what the chapter's really about in my eyes. It is about that, but I think from creatures to sons, the door to eternal life gives probably a better evaluation of what he's really getting at through the course of this book. So again, you can always check out my music. I'm always doing albums. I'm going to release my 10th album pretty soon, but thekingscourt.com or the homepage for my YouTube channel. There's 12 links that you can check out, all kinds of stuff there. So getting back to this book, I think the first thing to do is to give a definition. Just kind of wing it on that based on what he said. And making, he uses two words, making and begetting, and the difference between those two. So making really has to do with more of like a sculpture or an artist creating something that's different. So making could be anything, an architect. Okay, so any kind of craftsman. He's making something. That's pretty obvious. So in terms of God and humanity, we're creatures that are made, okay? And he goes on and discusses that throughout this. Human beings beget human beings, some human being that's like itself. We, in every sense of the word, we are only partially like God. In other words, God is eternal, we die, okay? So beginning, an animal begets another animal of the same sort. A human being begets another human being of the same sort. An artist makes a painting. I think you get the idea behind that. The reason why I did that is that's what he entitles this chapter. So getting into the chapter, everyone has really warned Lewis not to get too much deep into theology. People don't really want to hear too much of the in-depth stuff. They want practical religion. And, even though C.S. Lewis was warned against that, he didn't take their advice, and he doesn't think that humanity and the general humanity are really necessarily all fools, and they're smarter than these other people give them credits for. Theology is the science of God, and any man who wants to know about God would really like to have the most accurate ideas about him. So that's why he thinks it's important to get into this. Some people are put off by a theology, and he remembers that when he was giving a talk, there was an older gentleman, he was an officer, and he said, I've no use for all that stuff. I'm religious, but, and I think there's a God. I believe there's a God, and I've even felt that there's a God when I was out in the desert alone. I don't need to believe or follow all your dogmas about who you think God is. And to anyone who's really met the real thing, those dogmas may seem petty and unreal. So Lewis is saying, well, I really agreed with this man in some sense of the word. He probably did have some sort of experience out in the desert when he thought that he had an encounter with God. And when he looks at these Christian creeds, he doesn't think they're quite as real as the encounter that he felt like he had out in the desert. And if a man were to look out at the Atlantic Ocean, he would have much more of a real experience than going and looking at a map of the Atlantic Ocean. And he would think that the map was far less real than the real thing, which was to be out strolling the beach on the Atlantic. And he's trying to get to a point. You know, the map is really just colored paper. And the real point is that the map has some value, though. The value that it really has is that it shows you what people have found out and know about the Atlantic by hundreds or thousands of people sailing it. And so they're putting things on the map, and it really is quite useful in that sense. And there's a lot of experience behind the making of that map and all the people that sailed to make those maps that are useful for other people. It really reflects a lot of the experiences that these different people had. And if you want to get somewhere, a map is extremely useful and even necessary if you want to get there. But, you know, if you're really content with just walking along the beach, which is great, and you're having glimpses out over the ocean, and that's a lot of fun for you, but if you need to get to America, a map would be highly useful. We're saying theology, the whole point of this is that theology is really like a map. It's learning and thinking about the Christian doctrines, and they really are sort of like a map, and they're based on the experience of, he says hundreds, but you could say thousands, but reality is really millions and perhaps billions of people and who have been in touch with God. And if you want to get any further in the Christian life, it's probably a good idea to use a map. And then he says vague religion is just a feeling, you know, that you've experienced God in nature, and that's valid, but he calls that sort of like a vague religion, and it's very attractive because you're sensing you're out in nature and you experience this relationship with God, and it has a lot of thrills, but it has no work involved in it. Is what he says. And so that's very attractive. So he says, but you won't get eternal life by feeling the presence of God while, you know, going up and enjoying the fragrance of some beautiful and aromatic flower, okay, or listening to some beautiful music. That's great and it thrills you, but it's not going to get you eternal life. It's not going to get you to heaven. Neither will, you know, looking at a map get you anywhere unless you actually go out and sail on the sea. Nor will you really be very safe if you go to sea but you don't have a map. Who knows where you'll end up, right? So he's saying because of all this, theology is really just practical. And if you don't listen to theology, it won't mean that you have no ideas about God. It'll mean that you probably have a lot of wrong ideas. So think of it this way. Theology is, like he mentioned before, it's the accumulation of thousands, if not millions of people through centuries of time, and who have had similar experiences to you, but it's all pooled together in one source, and it's kind of feeding back on each other as different points come out and scriptures read and analyzed, and different minds are involved in thinking of these scriptures, and then pitted against other brilliant minds. And is really one single human mind all by himself able to cope with that kind, you know, of superiority, that they feel that they're superior to all of that? I think that's the point that he's really trying to get to. You're liable to come up with a lot of wrong ideas if you don't study some sort of theology. And a great many ideas are out there about God today. They're by some great theologians, and they've been coming along for centuries, like I just said. And the popular idea of Christianity is that Jesus is just a great moral teacher. I have a couple of videos on that. There's probably a few that downgrade that principle. But he's saying that's a popular view, that Jesus is just a great moral teacher. And if we took his advice, things probably would be better, and there would be a better social order in our country, and we might even be able to avoid some wars. It tells you even though those things might be true, it doesn't really tell you the whole truth about who Jesus Christ is. And so because of that, it doesn't have much practical value. And in fact, it's even giving you a false impression, because it's saying that this is only who Jesus is, in which in reality, Jesus is far more than that. And it's great that we take Christ's advice. And if we did, we probably would live in a happier world. But he says you don't really even need to go as far as Christ if that's all you want. You could just look at the writings of Aristotle or Plato or Confucius or people like that. And if we took their advice, we'd probably be a lot better world. But people don't tend to take the advice of other brilliant minds like the names I just said. And we historically haven't really followed their advice. Look at the world that we're in today. If Christianity only means one more bit of supposedly good advice, then you're saying Christianity really doesn't have much importance at all then. If that's all it is just advice. And he says there's no lack of good advice. There's always been good 4,000 years of good advice, but it doesn't really make much difference if people don't follow it. As soon as you look at real Christian writings, you find they're talking about something completely different than just good advice. They say, the theologians say, and the scriptures say, that Christ is the Son of God, whatever, and he did include these words, whatever that means. They also say that if people give him their confidence, they can become sons of God, whatever that means. Again, he wrote those words. And they also say that his death saved us from our sin, whatever that means. I like that was whatever that means, because that's the way I feel about certain things. Hell, for example, whatever that means, I don't know. Christianity claims to be telling us about another world. That's the first key statement in here in this chapter. It's telling us about another world. And Christianity tells us that by attaching ourselves to Christ, we can become sons of God. And some might say, aren't we already sons of God? Well, here's where he really gets into the title of what he gave as the title of this chapter. It says, well, in a certain sense, we are sons of God, but in another sense, not. He says, God did bring us into existence, and he loves us and takes care of us. And in some sense, he is definitely like a father. But when the Bible is talking about becoming sons of God, it's talking about something totally different. The creeds say that Christ is the Son of God, and he's the only begotten Son of God, and that he's not created. That's extremely important. The scriptures and the creed say that Christ is the Son of the Son of God, the only authentic, true Son of God, the one and only Son of God in this sense, because he's begotten, not created. So again, begotten is, he's of the same essence as the Father. So begotten by his Father, and not only that, before all worlds, before time existed, before the universe existed, Christ was and is and has always been, eternally been, and is begotten. So this is something that happened before nature even began, before all worlds. Christ is begotten. He was not created. Okay? And then he says, what does that mean? So, to beget is to become the father of. So, to create is to make. That's why I started with the definitions. You beget something the same kind as yourself. A man begets human babies. Okay? You make something of a different kind from yourself. A man makes a statue. If he is clever, he may make a statue that may even look very much like a man. But on the other hand, it's really not a man. It only kind of looks like a man, but hey, can it breathe? Or can it think? Is it alive, this statue? And he would say, well, then that is the first thing that he wants to get clear to your understanding, is that what God begets is God. I'll say that again. What God begets is God. And just as what man begets is man. What God creates is not God. I'll say that again. What God creates is not God. God begets God. God makes nature, makes man, makes animals. You see where he's getting here? So this is why men are not sons of God in the same sense that Christ is. We have the opportunity, I'll kind of jump again, to be adopted sons of God. Okay? But we will never be begotten sons of God. There is only one begotten Son of God, because he is of the same essence as God. Man has the same shape, sort of, or likeness of God, in the sense that Jesus was a man, and we looked pretty close to what he looked like, right? So, but he has not got the same kind of life that God has. Everything God has made has some likeness in some way to himself. And then he gives some examples, like space, it's huge. And in that sense, there's a kind of greatness to it. And in that sense, it's a sort of a symbol of God. In sort of like spiritual terms, he says, matter, it has energy, and God certainly has a lot of energy in all the work that he's done. And that's associated with maybe the power of God. And even the vegetable world is sort of, in some very dim way, sort of like God, because it's alive. God is a living thing, so he's thinking in the terms of a biological sense. But it's really only kind of a symbol or shadow of what God, the real thing is, what God really is. Fertility, even of insects, is sort of a dim resemblance to the unceasing activity that God has and all the craftiness that he has done throughout time in nature. And mammals have instinctive affection. We are all different gradations. It kind of makes me think of Plotinus, and the different gradations. Man is the closest in resemblance to God, for sure, since Jesus Christ, the living embodiment of God, is also a man. So man lives and loves and reasons, so in the biological sense, he's the highest known level that we know about. It's not God, so mankind is. So, but man, in his natural condition, and I'll say those words again, in his natural condition, doesn't have the fullness of spiritual life. What he's saying is that he has a different sort of life that God has. God has a higher sense of spiritual life. And then he goes on to give some examples of why he's saying that. The difference is simply in biological terms, and spiritual life is definitely of a higher sort. He gives them different names. The biological sort, which is associated with nature, it tends to run down and decay. We die. And it's only kept alive, and because of, we're part of nature, and we have to have air or water or food, or we die, and he calls this bios. And then a spiritual life is completely different. It's in God from all eternity. That's true spiritual life, and he calls that Zoe. So bias is sort of a shadowy, symbolic resemblance to Zoe. So, human beings are you could say those exact words, are a shadowy, symbolic resemblance of God, but not God. It's only a resemblance. It's like between a photo and a place, or a statue and a man. A man changed from Bios to Zoe would go through such a huge change. It would be the same as a statue change from being a carved stone into actually being a living human being. It's a radical transition. And this is what Christianity is all about, what I just said. It's that radical change. And I'll say those words again. It's like a statue being changed from a stone to a real man. That's the transition that happens in true Christianity. That's what Christianity is all about. And this world is really just a sculptor shop for the Great Sculptor. And he's just working on us statues. And there's a rumor going around the shop that some of us someday are going to come to life.